Hi everyone, in this video we'll be talking about how to work with indecisive stakeholders. Now stakeholders can be your client, vendor, your colleagues, boss, basically anybody you have to work with to get a project completed. Now the takeaways from this video is based from the book Good Leaders Ask Great Questions from John C. Maxwell, the renowned leadership expert. And the reason why it's so important to figure out how to work with indecisive stakeholders is because at times we don't get to pick the people we get to work with. However, we are expected to deliver a project within a timeline. So, in order to meet this goal, we have to avoid things that commonly crops up with indecisive decision making. For example, because of certain things they cannot move past decision making, then the project is stuck, wasted resources. For example, someone makes a decision A. After that, then they get indecisive. They wanted to explore B, C, D, E, F, G. However, your deadline is not changing anytime soon, and eventually end up going back to decision A. When events like this happens, that's when you get people stressed out, and that is a very strained professional relationship with each other. So I'll move on to the phases of how you can work better with indecisive stakeholders. The first phase is actually to have a very proactive setup and expectation management. From the get go, you should be able to clear definitions of roles and responsibilities. So, how you would do that is you will set up an Excel spreadsheet, and depending how you want to outline when's your timeline, when's your deadline, and all the stages that you need to complete this project. And also, what's important is to have a separate column of who is responsible for what decision. And next to that column, you want to have another column which is saying that what is the expected timeline for those decisions. The reason why you do that and share it with everybody involved in the project is because for a project to be able to deliver on its timeline, everybody needs to be informed on okay, what is needed for this project, and if I delay my decision, who else task gets affected by this decision. Whenever your document has this components, which is the RACI, responsible, accountable, a consultant, and form matrix, which means this allows people to know that let's say if we have delayed decisions in this process, how should we escalate it? Who can we get consensus from or be able to push this decision making forward? And after you have this proactive setup expectation management status, right? The second phase that is important is guiding the decision making process. Now, for those working on projects and you need to get buy-in or even decision making from different levels of approval, I think what will help you is to have a structured way of presenting options. Now, when it comes to presenting options, you have to provide very clear, concise information with well-defined pros and cons, cost implications, and alignment with stated goals. Now, how this usually works for me in the past is, for example, let's say if I'm creating visuals, let's say if I'm presenting visuals to be approved, if I present more than three options of visuals, then I know that it will make decision making harder because sometimes people will not be able to make a decision if you're presented with so many options. So I think it's best to scale it down to 2 to 3 options max, provide some level of thinking behind it. What are the pros and cons you have? So when you're dealing with someone that is indecisive, your ability to articulate how you view the options and guide them in like maybe the pros and cons and also cost implications is helpful. And not only that, if you face objection from the decision maker at that point in time, going back to how this task aligns back to the project goals is one way to reduce the indecisiveness. Sometimes you're left with someone that just making a decision that doesn't know how to articulate why they picked the decision. Or sometimes you end up with, for example, then they call more stakeholders to come and vote together. And then from that voting, then you arrive at some decision. For me personally, I think how to manage that is again to align back. This is deliverable, align with the overall objective. If yes, usually I find that it's easier to get people to sign off on a task or a deliverable. Now, the third process is that you have to be able to facilitate decision making. Now, for example, let's say you're from the side of the vendor and your client needs to make a decision, but they don't know how to assess it or they know how to review it. Then perhaps your role as a vendor is to actively guide them through this decision process. So, how you do that is by asking clarifying questions. For example, like, what is it that you're trying to fix? What are the things in the past that you noticed that didn't work for you? And what are you hoping to achieve from this project or task? And the next process is actually to summarize the options. Again, I think when summarizing options, I think it's about providing 2 to 3 options maximum sometimes, and then highlighting potential trade-offs in these options. And I think that is where the vendor can add a lot of value, because sometimes when clients are afraid to make decision is also partly because they have limited visibility on what these options will lead to and what are the consequences. So sometimes they do rely on vendors to do thinking for them when it comes to saying, okay, you want this outcome? ABCD will give you that. But with ABCD, there's a certain way to evaluate it. For example, costs. For example, how difficult it is to execute these options. For example, like what these options will entail in terms of detail and things like that. And how you can best also help to facilitate decision making sometimes is to take control by scheduling when you have to make certain meetings with a very clear agenda. Sometimes I feel personally that clients want to be led by their vendors sometimes when it comes to decisions that they need to make, but they just don't know how to get there. Managing indecisive stakeholders is tricky sometimes. Is how do you manage inconsistency and changes? For example, let's say a client make decision A, and then somehow they went into different iterations trying to explore options, and then they went back to decision D, for example. And then they claim that decision B was what everybody agreed to, but that's not the case. I think personally it's important to manage our own patience level, and also to also give gentle reminders of previous decision. And the reason why you might want to do that is because whenever you are dealing with stakeholders that are very indecisive, if they have a pattern in the past of everybody that works with them letting them dictate the flow of the decision making and changing it and having inconsistency to what was agreed upon and what was finally executed, then I feel sometimes they have been already trained to figure out that everybody will cater to the indecisiveness. Whereas if you are able to tell them and politely refer back to previous agreements or even written documentations or email and say that on this and date we agreed to this, to say for example option A. Can I understand what is the rationale for your shift to option D, for example? And getting the stakeholder to articulate what led them to decision D will sometimes save them, because they would think, actually, yes, like if I did not recall what was agreed upon on this date and I forgot what option it was, someone is keeping track of that for me, number one. Number two is to ensure we are aligned on the same vision. Both parties, or even how many other parties that are working on a project, need to know that on what day what was decided and what was the rationale for deciding, say, option A. And let's say if you really have to shift to option D, what is the rationale? Is this because you've forgotten what you discussed previously, or there was a concrete rationale back with information and data on what made you shift to option D? If yes, then everybody in the team working on this project can be aligned on what the rationale is. So going forward, we as a team operate stronger. I think sometimes the frustration of working with indecisive stakeholders is that when they cannot articulate the rationale behind their change of the decision, and they expect the people they're working with to shift as when they shift, the scary part is everybody's thinking, okay, so you made this decision today, you changed it 1 week later, will you change it a few days later? So I think that's when this change will also impact the deadline, number one. Number two is also impact your original objectives. And part of this, I think it's tricky, is that you have to be able to maintain some sort of patience and also figure out that, yes, there are times that sometimes change will be made, but if you're able to get people to come to the table and articulate what is the rationale for the change, then I realize that maybe as a team we get better insight as to what is affecting people's decision making, and can we then develop a better decision making model on our end. And I think part of managing inconsistency change conversation with stakeholders is also to say one thing that's very clear. We have to outline the implications of any requested change on the timeline, budget, and resources. Now, sometimes the person that's requesting the change may not have a clear understanding as to this change will impact a lot of people working on this project. Do we have the allowances for these components that will be impacted? If yes, and if everybody is clear on what's going on, then yes, there will be some sort of change, formal change request document or email or communication that you can give to the client documenting this is what's going to happen per your request. These are estimated impact and I need to get your approval here. So whenever we make changes right now, is there is a constant assessment in the background saying that unless this change is truly crucial and does not impact our timeline, our deadline, our resources, then yes, perhaps this might be possible. From the get-go, our decision making time has to be as accurate or as well thought out as possible so that we avoid a lot of inconsistencies and changes that does not make sense to our overall objective. Now, the fourth phase, after having all these discussions about managing inconsistency and change, this is something that's quite critical, but I do think that it will help the team as they go forward. Is that how do you have continuous improvement and learning with your decision making and project management? Is to have a post project review. So after the project concludes, conduct an internal review to identify lessons when it comes to managing the client's decision or the stakeholders' decision making style. So what it means sometimes, depending on the size and scope of the project, let's say if it's a smaller project, perhaps you have a schedule meeting that you decided to list down what are the things you observed, what went well, what didn't go so well, and what can be improved in the future. I think times when we come across indecisive stakeholders is when we notice after a period of time there are patterns of repeated behavior happening over and over again with different projects, with different people that they work with different timelines. I think what gets people very frustrated is that they can't seem to break out of this continuous cycle when they're working with indecisive stakeholders. But I do think that maybe what is lacking is a conversation on process and approach. How do we work more effectively with people in general? And I think that perhaps there's four steps that would probably help us to get there. Things will not be perfect, but I feel that whenever we get into the practice of conducting internal review to identify lessons in this, for example, project, right? What effectively we're doing is we can take the learnings going forward. Whenever we have this review process, it also forces people to think, what are the areas can I do better at? And this is a joint collaborative effort with everybody in the project. So I think when we do this post internal review, it helps us to be more objective to what are things that we can do better, or we started to spot patterns of things that how can we avoid getting the situations where we make very quick decisions and this is not well thought out, and then we end up wasting time or we end up wasting resources. So I think having that constant conversation, I think, helps to improve working together with different stakeholders that we work with.